Hello, I'm Tom Clements with Flight Review Incorporated, and I've enjoyed flying and instructing in King Airs for over 25 years. In the program you're about to view, I'll be demonstrating procedures and techniques for flying the King Air correctly and proficiently, safely, and to the extent possible, simply as well. The airplane we'll be using is the one you see here, an early model C-90 with Pratt & Whitney PT6A-20 power plants. However, the procedures presented, with some variations, apply in many ways to all King Airs, from the earliest 90s to the latest 350s. If you're preparing for an initial training class on a particular King Air model, or for that matter, if you're getting ready for your umpteenth refresher course on this very, very fine aircraft, I think you'll find our video worthwhile. So come on, let's go flying. Before starting engines checklist, I'm going to be doing this as a do list. I want you to realize that flying single pilot especially, we must adapt ourselves to the cockpit and do things with certain flow patterns, and then use the checklist in the way it's intended, as a check that things have been done. And you'll see me doing that during some of our flights. However, for training purposes and when you're new to the aircraft, because we don't quite have those flow patterns developed yet, the checklist becomes more of a do list where each step is read and then done appropriately. So that's how we'll start out here. And also, I don't normally wear gloves for flying, but to keep the reflections down for the videotaping, that's why I have these on today. So before starting engines, the exterior check's completed, the baggage and door is secured, and the passenger's been briefed, and now I'm pulling the parking brake handle, pressing my feet a few times to build up pressure to set the parking brake. The condition levers are in the fuel cutoff position. The propeller levers are as desired, which in most cases is full forward, unless there's a problem with wind or noise, which the props will generate. Power levers at idle. The cabin sign switch is on. The beacon switch is on. The battery switch is on, and we're doing a couple things different now. I have the battery already on and the avionics master switch on so that the intercom works for the purposes of the video presentation. Voltmeters, we're showing about 25 volts on each meter, which confirms the current limiters are okay. The fuel quantity, we're full of fuel. The weight and center of gravity, we've checked that the center of gravity is okay, and our takeoff weight will be about 9,100 pounds. And now I turn on the left and right boost pump switches, and the appropriate fuel pressure lights extinguish, and we're ready for start. As to which engine is started, except for King Airs with superchargers on the left engine, there's really not much of a preference. Traditionally, the right engine is done first, and that's what I'll do first this time. The right propeller area is clear. The right start switch is coming to the top position, and then I'll take my finger away from it, so I have no chance of turning it off too early, and I'll point at a few of the items of interest where my eyes are going. The ignition light came on. The N1 gauge is stabilizing at 19.5%. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the condition lever goes full forward. 1, 2, 3. I see a light off in N1. I hear it. The ITT is coming up. I have my finger at about 900 degrees, ready to chop off the fuel if the temp goes too far. And the engine stabilizes at approximately the high idle position, 70%. The propeller, as you see, is now coming out of feather. I'll turn off the start switch, turn on the generator switch. You may notice the right ITT rose there as the generator workload increased. And we're letting the battery charge down, in this case, to about a 30% reading, because this airplane is equipped with lead acid batteries. With the nickel cadmium batteries, we wait for a 50% reading. We're there. The right generator switch is being turned off. The left propeller is clear. Now I'll turn on the left start switch, pause just a moment to let the N1 gauge get past 12% approximately. It's not critical. And then restore the right generator online. Here we go. Left propeller is clear. Left start switch on. Right generator on. The ignition light's on. And with the help of the generator assisting, this engine is going to 22%. Waiting 5 seconds for the glow plug to get hot. That should be long enough. And this condition lever comes approximately to the 60% area. Today is warm enough that I'll probably be running the air conditioning, so I'm estimating that's where I want my idles. Notice how much cooler the second engine starts because of the generator assist. So the temperature's good, the idle speed's good, my left start switch is off. Now I verify that both voltmeters show the voltage of the operating generator, the right generator, 28 volts, a verification that we did not blow a current limiter during the start. At that time, the left generator switch comes on, and with two generators sharing the workload, we can match up the condition levers for approximately 60% idle. Now, once you have your condition levers set to where the idle speeds are approximately together, do the fine-tuning to match up the propeller speeds. So the airplane taxis straighter, sounds nicer. At this time, the propellers are on the low-pitch stops. They're not on the governor. And so what I do with the prop controls makes no difference unless I pull so far back that the propeller starts to feather. So with fixed-pitch propellers, the idle speed is controlled by the power of the engines, and so by adjusting those condition levers, which are quite sensitive, to get the propeller speeds as close as practical together, then once we have it, we'll just tighten up the friction knob and leave it there virtually from now on. The after starting checklist procedure is a left-right flow pattern with the transfer pumps on the fuel panel coming on, the cross-feed switch in auto. I'm verifying that the generator switches are on. Obviously, we turn them on in the start, but the main reason for this check is that had we used external power for the start, the generators would not yet have come on until this point in our flow patterns. The volts and amps are normal. The inverter switch, I'll check number 1, and it's working, and go to number 2. Just as we can alternate starts, we recommend alternating the use of the inverters. The avionics master, as I said, is already on, but to protect the radios, I turn them off individually. So at this time, I'm going to be turning the radios on here manually, which would not typically have to be done. Fuel control heat switches. Early King Air models had switches that we have to turn on for every flight to heat the lines going to the fuel control. In many later King Airs, those switches are hidden inside the power quadrant on the condition levers, and they come on automatically when the condition levers are advanced from fuel cutoff. The coffee bar switch I don't need to use today. I'm verifying propeller levers are feather, or full forward, so that if I had started in feather, I don't leave them there too long. It's not so much that it's detrimental to the engine, but rather we're not blowing air back across the oil cooler, the battery vents, removing our exhaust heat from the nacelle area, and so forth. That's why it's important to have propellers forward and not stick too long in the feathered position. The condition levers. Because of the temperature today being about 20 degrees Celsius, anticipating the air conditioning, I have these up to run approximately at 60% idle, which makes the engines nice and cool. Now, when we turn on the air conditioning, we'll load up the generators, which will cause the IT to rise. Here comes the air conditioning coming on. The fuel control units are nothing more than governors for N1. And although, like any governor, it may have a very slight error and let the N1 change a small amount, but in this case, the N1 stayed basically the same, and the temperature went up as the generator load forced the fuel control to put in more fuel to the engine to maintain that idle speed. AC voltage, I'm looking over the co-pilot side to check that it's proper, which it is. My engine instruments. Because we spend so much time looking at the left side of the engine instruments or the top for those King Airs with vertical stacks, whenever the checklist says engine instruments, I try to force myself to go to the ones I don't look at very much, the fuel flow, the oil temperature, and pressure gauges. Now, you may find it strange that during the start, I did not mention checking oil pressure. That's because in early King Airs, such as this one, the fuel flow, the oil pressure, and the torque gauges are all AC instruments, alternating current. They require an inverter to be on before they work, and to save battery drain, we don't have the inverter on during starts. So at this time is the first time I can truly check that the oil pressure is okay. The fact that the propellers came out of feather is an interim check that at least the engine had enough oil pressure to move the oil to the propeller governor and let the pump there bring the propellers out of feather. For you who are fortunate enough to fly the later King Air models after about the 1975-76 time frame, your oil pressure gauges are DC powered. They will be working during the start, and they could be checked immediately when we started the engines. The HSI and RMI heading looks like it's slaved properly. The flight director button has been depressed to conduct a self-test for that. Not all King Airs require that, some do. And now basically it's a matter of releasing the park and brake and taxiing when we're ready for that procedure. I'll release the parking brake, check around for traffic, and we need to roll to the far end of this runway 27 for runway 9 departure with the wind lightly out of the east today. As we roll forward, I'm checking the brakes. As I make the turn, I'm going to check the turn needles for proper operation. And you know, the left turn needle is not working. That's why we check those things. Well, the reason is because I had the circuit breaker pulled for that while we were doing some of these checks in the cockpit, setting up the video cameras, and consequently, we didn't want that instrument to run that necessarily. But that's why it's so important to check these things on a regular basis. I use the term judicious suspicion. We never quite know when something's going to fail. And if we're suspicious enough in a judicious manner, maybe we'll find these little problems before they find us by surprise. Now, as soon as the airplane's taxiing at a reasonable speed, to avoid riding the brakes, you'll notice I've picked the power levers up and come back into the beta range. Even though the N1 has not changed, in fact, the left has slipped back just a little bit, which I'll readjust, but the propellers have increased speed. Well, that's merely because we've made the propeller bite of air get less. The blade has gone flatter, and we've eliminated some of our residual taxi thrust. So I can maintain a reasonable taxi speed here without using the brakes. Now, to demonstrate, to come to a stop, we'll apply brake pressure, and for a nice ride for the passengers, just about the time we're coming to a dead stop, we'll ease up in that pressure a little bit so we don't dip the nose and tip everyone's coffee cups. And then once we're dead stopped, we'll hold the brakes tightly, we'll move the power levers back over the gate to idle. That does two nice benefits, two or three. Number one, it makes the airplane quieter by slowing the propellers down due to their bigger bite of air. Second, it continues to blow that wind back we talked about for the advantages of better cooling, for the oil coolers especially. And finally, if and when we ever shut down the airplane, which involves feathering the propellers, and the power levers are back in the beta or reverse range position, this can cause damage to our propeller linkage. So always when you come to a dead stop, we get the habit pattern of bringing those condition levers to the idle position. To roll, simply releasing the hold on the brakes, the airplane starts moving forward, and once it develops a bit of momentum, then back into the beta range to slow it down. Beta officially ends when the N1 increases, when we pick up power. If we pick up power at slow speeds, the potential for prop erosion increases. So to be back in the striped area, the reverse area below 40 knots, is a no-no. I'm going to demonstrate briefly here by taking the left power lever back far enough that you'll see the N1 gauge increase. Now, there it is. So now we're officially in the reverse range. Also, you notice the propeller started slowing down as it took that negative bite of air. So unless we're going fast after the landing on a rollout above 40 knots, or we're in a very, very swept clean run-up area, that's not a good thing to be doing at slow speeds. There's sometimes where, due to the strong presence of a tailwind, flattening the blades is not very effective for slowing down taxi speed. An alternate position or technique is leave the propellers at idle, or power levers at idle, and feather the propellers. Now there's no surface area for the wind to push against, and the airplane simply coasts forward. And as it gets quite slow and we need some more thrust, we bring the propeller levers full forward, and the oil pressure buildup in the prop dome slowly but surely brings the propellers out of the feathered position back to the low pitch stop. It's very important when we're doing that we leave the power levers at idle. I have enough momentum. I should be able to make a pretty tight turn here just with the momentum alone, combined with that low pitch stop blade angle thrust, bringing me around. Now, with a bit of experience in the airplane, without all the jabbering I'm doing for the instructional purposes, we would be ready for takeoff at this time. We'd have our before takeoff checklist completed. However, again, I'll do it now as a do list, not as a checklist, so you can follow along with what I'm doing. Before takeoff check, pressurization. We're going to 16,000 feet. I turn the cabin altitude knob and set the small window at 16,500 feet. While I'm here, I make sure the rate knob is appropriate from past experience, and I make sure the cabin pressure control switch has not accidentally been moved to the dump position, is still in the pressure position. Now for trim tabs: rudder, aileron, elevator, pitch trim, all three are set properly. The flaps in most 90s, except for the F90, takeoffs are virtually always done with flaps up, except for a soft field condition. In the F90s, the 100, 200, 300 series, charts exist to give us an option for using approach flaps on takeoff. But here, we'll take off flaps up. Flight controls. Full travel, proper direction, freedom, top and bottom. The ailerons, the elevators, and rudder, all free, proper travel. Avionics. I have the Unicom frequency in, and I'm listening to that now. I have Columbus approach, I think the proper frequency set for my next call. I'm talking 1200. I'll set the altitude initially at about 6,000 feet, both here and here, and I think I can stay visual to at least 6 before we get our IFR clearance higher up. I have the flight plan set in with a leg to Findlay, and the initial course is 344. That's been set on the HSI. Let me set the heading bug on runway heading, and set the flight director for go-around and heading modes. Both NAV1 and NAV2 are on Findlay, which is too far away to receive just yet at this time. I happen to be monitoring GARD, the 121.5 frequency in COM2. That's just an old habit that if I'm not using that radio for something else, I'll typically do that at this time. So I think my avionics are ready for this departure. Suction-matic pressure gauges are not in the video. They're on the right side of the cockpit, but they look normal for the idle power condition we're in. Fuel quantity, it also looks still good. I know we checked it before, but that's important enough to check one more time. Engine and flight instruments. Again, the engine instruments, looking at the ones I don't look at every time, continue across, everything looks normal, ready to go. Friction locks. When I'm doing the use of feathering and bait on the ground, I have the friction knobs rather loose, but now I want to make sure they're snugged up tight enough, not that it takes superhuman effort to move the controls, but certainly that they're not going to slip when we don't want them to slip. And finally, our takeoff data and briefing, and even if it's just talking to yourself, that's important. Here we have slightly over a 6,000 feet runway. We're not at gross weight, so this takeoff is going to be done with a slow rotation starting at the V1 VR speed of about 97. But if we have an engine failure up to then, or even after that, if the gear's still down, I'll be planning simply to close the throttles and land in the remaining runway. But once I've reached about 110 knots and I'm definitely airborne in a positive climb, then the gear will come up. Any real engine failures at that point will be considered an in-flight emergency, and we will, in this case, remain VFR, return to Darby Dan for repairs if anything like that should happen. That's the completion of the before takeoff checklist. The runway lineup is next to go. I'll make a call on the radio to let people know what we're doing, and then the runway lineup flow pattern is a right to left progression, as you'll see. Runway lineup. Some King Airs, certainly they have enough power that they can take off with the air conditioning on and still be able to get full torque, no problems with the ITT well within limits. The old Dash 20 powered airplane, that's rarely the case, except in a cold day. So what I've done now is turn off the air conditioning. I've left the fan going so we have some circulation. Now the flow pattern comes along to bleed air switches, and again, because it's summertime, I'm choosing to leave those off. In many King Airs, you turn them on at this time, or, as we'll see, turn them on right after takeoff, one at a time. The transponder's on, the radar's on, I'm getting the strobe lights, the landing lights joined with the taxi light now, and I don't need any ice protection items yet, so I think we're ready to go. Looking around behind me for any traffic. I move the power lever slowly until the propeller speed's around 1500 to avoid ITT spiking. At that point, I can just let fly about as fast as I want with a slight hesitation right now as the props come up on the governors. Now bringing the torques up and watching temps. And it looks like I can get to about 1,200 foot-pounds of torque, 1150, with the temperatures well within limits. I'm lightening up the control wheel at 80 knots and letting the airplane start flying here. And we're airborne. Positive rate, coming up at 110. Gear up. I'm turning on one bleed air and turning off the landing and taxi lights. Watching that my power levers don't slip. monitoring torques and temps. Because of the proximity to a tower-controlled airport, we're starting a quick turn out here. At about 400 feet above the ground, I'll verify the flaps are up. I'll turn on the yaw damper. I'll pull the torque back to around 1100, knowing the torque will increase when the propellers get reduced. And now the props will come back to 2000 RPM. Tightening up the friction again, restoring the prop sync on. Going to set my little altitude reminder with the green up, since we'll be flying a hard altitude IFR eventually. Now readjusting my torque. For purposes of normal operation flight training, the limits we teach on these models is 1,200 foot-pounds of torque or 700 degrees as hard limits. If we had real emergencies and needed the performance of red lines, we'd certainly go to that, 750 degrees or 1315 torque. But for today's training, we'll generally use the 7 and 12 as limits. Columbus approach, King Air 9442 Quebec.
9442 Quebec off of Darby Dan going to Mansfield.
Yeah, that's us. Training flight. Like to go to Findlay first, then Mansfield.
Okay. Let me see here. Maintain VFR at, looks like you're at 3 right now. Is that correct?
That's affirmative.
Anywhere around 3 is fine. VFR. Squawk is 3437.
3437 for 42 Quebec. And we'll level off 3.5.
Be fine, too.
Now, we've done that little Y pattern flow. The tips of the Y letter were the gear up and the lights off. The center of the Y were to verify flaps are up or to retract them in some models. And the base of the Y is yaw damper on. If we've done that, there's no big rush to get to anything real soon. I've also turned on that one bleed air package, and we are starting to pressurize. The differential pressure is up to about 0.8 or so, and the cabin is climbing at about 500 feet a minute.
Somebody called Skybox 1826.
So in this busy traffic area, I'd rather keep my attention more outside for scanning purposes rather than doing lots of working with checklists right now. Okay, what I pointed out there was that to maintain 1,200 foot-pounds of torque a moment ago, it took about 96, 97%. And that hasn't changed within reason now. But as we go higher into thinner air, it's easier for the engine to spin and maintain that speed. So it takes less fuel flow. Fuel flow has been decreasing, which also gives us less power, so the torque is coming down. However, the ITT tends not to change very much because of the fact that the thinner air gives less cooling in the engine, the reduction in airflow gives less heating, and actually ITT stays pretty constant in the climb. Looks like the clouds are getting nearby. To prepare for ice protection on this model, there are 13 items I have to do, and I do those in a left-right flow pattern. The auto-ignition switches on the pilot's left sub-panel are now armed. I reach below the panel and pull out the ice vanes. Watch the torques. Get a slight reduction. The bottom row of switches, pitot heats, I check for load increase. Prop, I look for its meter. Left lip boot, right lip boot, I check for generator output increases. Fuel vents, stall warning. The pitot fuel vents and stall, some people run with on all the time. They call them the hot 5, and that's fine if they want to. Pulls very little current, very hard to tell that they're working by looking at the load meters. And finally, windshield heat. And not only does the load increase, but the magnetic compass swings a bit when we do that. So now, with all 13 items on, I'm prepared for icing flight. The only thing now is if I really start collecting ice on the airframe to make sure I keep the airspeed no less than 140. Right now it looks quite light. I'm not seeing anything clinging at all, so I'm not hesitating to let the speed slightly go below that in the climb. Now we have a bit of a breathing spell, so let's do our after takeoff checklist. The landing gear is up, the lights in the handle are off. The landing tax light switches are off. The flaps are verified up, the yaw damper is on. The propellers are about 2,000, the prop sync is on. Bleeder switches. I'm going to bring the second bleeder on now. And the temperature seems pretty good as is, this altitude without air conditioning. So I think I'll just leave everything as is there. A pressurization. With the slight surge the cabin went through when the left bleeder got turned on, I see the cabin is at about 4,500 feet. which is the altitude we have set it to go to. And the differential is about 2.2 psi. So we are pressurizing. Engine instruments, again, from right to left. And I'm virtually at my 700-degree climb limit, the limit I choose to use for climb. So from this point on, we'll simply have to abide with the dropping torque and not be able to gain it back because it would force the ITT past limits. Cabin sign switch, we'll turn that off. It's pretty smooth. Outside check, I'm looking for fuel leaks, for any oil out of the cowling, any unusual thing on the wings that I should be aware of. Through 10,000 feet in the clouds. As we're climbing out now, let's do a bit of a discussion about the pressurization controller. As you see, the cabin's at 4,500 feet, which is what it's been set for. So right now, the controller has brought the cabin to the altitude we've asked for, has been obedient to our request. This is nothing more than a governor for cabin altitude, to hold the cabin. So if I set the cabin lower, let's go to 3,000 feet. Notice the rate and what happens to the cabin. One thing you notice about the rate is it went well below what it will stabilize at. There's a rate sensitivity about the controller, and to avoid bumping the passenger's ears, it's a good idea to not only turn the rate... Direct Finley for 42 Quebec. Pause just a minute as I get that new one in here.
I just want to confirm you are landing at Mansfield whenever you're complete with your training there?
That is affirmative, and now we're going direct Finley.
Very good, thank you.
So it's rate sensitive, so to avoid giving the passenger's ears an unexpected bump, when we set the cabin lower, turn the rate low, go very slow for a few turns until the rate of descent stabilizes. Then you can crank it on down. So now it's stabilized. I could set it on lower altitude, no problem. If I turn the rate to minimum after a time for response, notice how slow the cabin starts going down. I'm between layers for a moment, so I think I'll retract the ice vanes, although it looks like we may be going into clouds higher up, so I'll leave the rest of the ice protection on, and I'll return some exterior lights. I'm going to turn the rate knob to maximum now, and I want you to observe after the slow response what the maximum rate of cabin descent is. Also notice that the cabin altitude is now descending under about 3,800 feet. The differential pressure is rapidly increasing up to 4 and going up. Because the cabin goes down and we go up, there's certainly more difference between inside and outside pressure. Let's put the rate back at a minimum setting. Now let's bring the cabin all the way up. Let's tell it to come to 8,000 feet. So it should reverse its travel, and with the minimum rate set in, barely be creeping up at all. As I turn the rate knob to maximum, watch, the cabin should get with the program pretty good. Although there's no big problem at running at maximum differential pressure, the typical suggestion is to set the small window, or in some later controllers, the inner scale value, to a number about 500 feet higher than you're planning to go. Now the controller does not know that we're looking there when we set the 16.5. All it knows that the big hand went back to about 4,600 feet. So that's where the cabin should level off at. But not until I go to 16.5 in the airplane would we be at max differential. Consequently, we'll be flying at slightly less than the max differential pressure. I've just hit the altitude hold button on the autopilot as we reach 16,000. Climb power is still set. You notice the ITT around 700 degrees. It looks like we'll be staying between layers for quite some time. In that case, I'm going to turn off the engine lip boot heaters and the prop heat. They, along with the windshield heat, are the larger users of electricity concerning the ice protection. I don't want to choose to turn the windshield heat off because I'm afraid to let it get cold soaked and have to heat it up later. So once I've got that on and need to use it later on, I'll tend to leave it on. But prop heat and lip boot heaters, they can come off and on at will. I'll also leave those other little hot 5-ons as they're pulling so little load. Now while the autopilot's holding altitude and the airplane's accelerating into cruise, It gives me time now to check the outside air temperature gauge and consult a graph or a table to see what the appropriate cruise torque to set is. For all King Airs except the Garrett-powered B100 with the TPE 331 engine on it, in all other cases, our primary power instrument is torque for setting takeoff and cruise power. ITT is a secondary gauge. So I'm looking at the outside air temperature gauge and seeing it reads about -6, and at 16,000 feet, the altimeter setting is so close to standard we can use that without a correction. Looks like we're looking at around the way we set power in this C90 with about a 10% reduction off a book, around 840 foot-pounds. Now the airplane's finished accelerating. I'm turning off prop sync, loosening the friction control, and bringing the props back to cruise, 1900. The gauge you're seeing here is called the prop sync scope, and I'm not sure if it's showing up in our video area. If it's not, fine. But that's an aid in keeping the propeller synchronized. If I can keep that from rotating, I know that not only my...
Here, 4 Quebec or 2 Quebec, do you care what heading you fly, sir?
Not really, 4-2 Quebec.
Okay, 4-2 Quebec, turn right heading 070, I'll keep in my sector.
070, 4-2 Quebec. Okay, clearing out to the right, starting to turn that way. So, what I was saying is we can help keep the prop synchronized when we change from one RPM to another. It's okay to leave prop sync on while you're doing that, and an airplane you're very familiar with and you know what the relationship of left and right propeller lever position is to keep them on the governors within sync, that's fine. A new airplane, I'd suggest you turn it off and on. So now, having pulled the props back, the torque went up a bit, and now it's time to set that value of 840, which the chart told us to set. I'll make a small attempt to get it there, pause a moment, finish the turn, and then make a better attempt to fine-tune it. Doing engine condition trend monitoring, ECTM as Pratt & Whitney calls it, it's very important that after you've made 1 or 2 attempts to set the torque properly according to the chart, that you then not readjust it for at least 5 minutes, preferably 15 or 20, before you take your set of engine readings. And even if that means that due to slight errors in the torque gauge or due to our sloppiness in setting it, when it comes time to take the reading that it changes from 840, that's okay. Go ahead and record at that time what you see exactly to get the best accuracy for the trends. So now I'm looking over and trying to get these pretty close. I think they're good enough for government work, as we say. And that also gave us a fuel flow of about 200 pounds an hour. And the temperature, I always like to see in these models somewhat below 680. I find that in the cooler days, by setting book power, we tend to be in the 660, 670 area. In the hot summertime, we're more up at the 680 ballpark. The actual cruise limit for this model is 705, but I feel not quite as comfortable running it for a long time there as I do back at that 680 figure. So torque is your primary power setting instrument. The ITT is support. As a sidelight, you'll also find that the N1s you end up having when you do that almost always within about a percentage point of what you see each other time you do this, whether you're at 8,000 feet or 28,000 feet. C-90s rarely climb high enough where with their high rate of descent in the emergency configuration that really the need for oxygen would be great. But certainly depending on altitude, the first consideration if we had a loss of pressurization causing the emergency descent would be to don oxygen mask. On the other hand, I think an equally valid reason for an emergency descent might perhaps be a medical emergency involving a passenger having a seizure or a heart attack, and we need to get him to that major airport.
Number 9442 Quebec, contact Mansfield approach 124.2, and keep them advised. We'll see you.
Thanks a lot for your help, 24-2. So maybe more realistic is to get down to that airport right below you and get an ambulance.
Okay, yeah, we get it.
So here we go for the emergency descent. Autopilot's coming off. The power lever's coming all the way back to idle rapidly. The propeller levers are smooth and being advanced full forward. I'm slowing to 156 for the gear speed. I get in the flaps first to 174. I'm below 156. The gear's coming down. I verified the flaps have extended approach. 3 green, no red, the gear's down. I'm now dropping the nose, looking for 156 knots. As I go into the clouds, I'll stop these turnings. I was doing a bit of turning there to check for traffic. And seeing what pitch attitude will go ahead and give me this descent rate I'm desiring. Right now I'm looking at around 11 degrees pitch down, 149 knots. Mansfield approach, King Air 9442 Quebec, out of 15,000 for 9,000.
49442 Quebec, Mansfield approach. Good morning, altimeter 2990.
2990. I think we'll be breaking out of the clouds and probably be canceling IFR, doing some air work in your area before we come in for a landing. 42 Quebec.
42 Quebec, roger. And did you want to continue your descent?
6,000.
Yeah, if we could have maybe a block 7 to 9 initially.